The oldest records of humanity describe a world so strange that it seems impossible. Civilizations that flourished for centuries under the rule of beings that were not entirely human. Ancient texts written with mathematical precision that describe an era before the sky opened. Genesis records 1,600 years of human history between Eden and the flood, with exact names and ages. 16 centuries in which violent men lived. 800 years without dying or losing their power. The answer lies in the texts, and what they reveal is more disturbing than any legend can imagine. The first death in human history was not a disease, it was not an accident, it was a murder. Genesis 4-8 records that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him in the ground where they were formed. The first thing humanity invented after the fall was not a tool or a city, it was violence. God confronted Cain and gave him the opportunity to confess his crime before the only witness that mattered. Cain did not repent, did not weep for his brother, and showed no remorse before the Creator who was watching him. He complained that his punishment was more than he could bear, as if he were the real victim. And then he did something that would define the next 16 centuries of the history of the known world. Genesis 4:16 records that Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and settled in the land of Nod. He turned away from God, crossed to the east of Eden, and built something that no one in history had ever built before. He built a city, the first city in human history, constructed by a murderer with blood on his hands. He named it Enoch, in honor of his own son, a city founded on an undeclared, yet absolute principle. Every wall raised without a prayer, every stone placed without a sacrifice, a civilization without God. And within that city, a dynasty emerged that advanced at a speed that the texts themselves describe as terrifying. Genesis 4:17-24 outlines the descendants of Cain with a precision that reveals the structure of that world. Lamech, the great-great-grandson of Cain, became the first recorded polygamist in all sacred scriptures. He took 2 wives named Ada and Zillah, and from that union were born the founders of the industries of the ancient world. Jabal became the father of those who dwell in tents and raise livestock, the birth of the nomadic industry. Jubal became the father of all who play the harp and the flute, the recorded inventor of music. And Tubal-Cain became the forger of all the bronze and iron tools in human history. The first weapon manufacturer recorded in the Bible shared the same home as the inventor of music. The lyre and the forge were born from the same family, from the same house, from the same father, under the same ancient roof. Beauty and violence were not opposing forces in that world. They were sister industries that fed off each other. Entertainment and war were invented by the same generation with the same hands in the same home. And then Lamech stood before his 2 wives and pronounced the first poem that the scriptures record accurately. Genesis 4:23-24 preserves his words. He killed a man for wounding him and a young man for striking him mercilessly. And he claimed that if Cain's vengeance was 7 times greater, then Lamech's would be 77 times larger. The first poem recorded in writings is not a hymn of worship, nor an elegy. It is a murder ballad. A man boasting about having killed a boy with a single blow, not confessing to the crime, but bragging about it, and claiming that his capacity for violence surpassed that of his ancestors, as if that were an honorable achievement. But there was another line that ran parallel to that of Cain, and the texts record it with equal genealogical precision. Genesis 4:25-26 recounts that Eve had another son whom she named Seth, because God had granted her another offspring. Two lineages, two absolutely opposing directions walking simultaneously on the same land for centuries. The lineage of Cain built civilization without God, while the lineage of Seth preserved worship in the midst of that world. The lineage of Seth produced Enoch, the only man in the antediluvian world who completely escaped death. Genesis 5:24 records that Enoch walked with God and disappeared because God took him, a living sign of another way. The lineage of Seth also produced Methuselah, who lived 969 years, the longest life in all scriptures. And the grandson of Methuselah was Noah, the last name in that lineage before the known world ceased to exist. Now apply the ages recorded in Genesis 5 to the lineage of Cain, and what emerges before you is deeply terrifying. Imagine a violent, proud, and polygamous warlord like Lamech, who does not die at 70 or 80 years old. Imagine that this man lives for centuries, accumulating power, territory, wives, and weapons, without anyone stopping him. Without a death to end his reign, without old age to weaken his control, without any possible generational change. The same tyrant ruling the same territory for 500, 600, and 700 years without interruption. In our world, dictators are limited by mortality. In the antediluvian world, that limit did not exist. A wicked man could dominate an entire region for longer than most historical civilizations have lasted. Generation after generation of ordinary people being born and dying under the shadow of the same eternal ruler. Evil composing itself for 800 years in a single human life, without interruption and without death to erase it. That was the world before the flood, and it was about to get worse in a way that the texts describe with disturbing accuracy. Something entered the human world that should never have, crossing a boundary set by God. And that border crossing corrupted everything it touched at a speed that the texts describe as total and absolute. Genesis 6:1-2 records that when men began to multiply, the sons of God saw the women. They saw that they were beautiful and decided to take them as wives and companions. The phrase children of God in Hebrew is Bene Elohim, and its meaning in the Old Testament is not ambiguous to anyone. This expression appears in Job 1-6, in Job 2-1, and in Job 38-7. And in each instance, it refers to angelic beings before God. Some scholars propose that the sons of God were descendants of Seth, or kings who claimed divine authority. But the weight of the textual evidence in Hebrew and in the New Testament points to something much darker and more disturbing. Jude 1-6 records that the angels who did not keep their positions of authority abandoned their proper dwelling forever. These angels are not free. They are imprisoned, chained in darkness, awaiting judgment for their transgression. What they did was so serious that God didn't just punish them, He locked them away so they could never repeat it again. 2 Peter 2-4-5 confirms that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into the abyss, chained. And the following verse makes a direct reference to Noah and the flood, linking both events in a direct causal chain. Pedro deliberately connects these facts. Crossing a boundary, angelic beings abandoned their natural station. They entered the human world in a way that God had neither designed nor allowed, and the result was catastrophic. Genesis 6-4 records that the Nephilim were on the earth when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means The fallen, those who descended without permission. The word powerful is Gibborim in Hebrew. Warriors, champions, beings of a strength that the world has never seen before. Renowned men translates literally as men of the name, figures whose fame filled the entire land with astonishment. These are the beings that later civilizations would remember in their mythologies as demigods and heroes of the past. How did it feel to live alongside them in that world where their footsteps shook the ground beneath your own feet? Centuries after the flood, the Israelite spies found in Canaan the descendants of the Anakim, a late echo. Numbers 13:33 preserves their report. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we must have seemed to them. That was just a remnant, a distant shadow of what existed before the flood, in its most complete and powerful form. In the antediluvian world, they were not a rarity in a remote region. They were everywhere and absolutely dominated everything. Picture encountering them on the street, the ground trembling with their steps, as they take what they desire without opposition. Imagine knowing that no human being on Earth has the physical power to withstand what those beings decide to do. These were not stories told to scare children. They were neighbors. They were rulers. They were the kings of that world. And the ordinary men were, as the Hebrew spies themselves said, like locusts under their feet in size and power. But this incursion was neither random nor accidental. It had a strategic direction that the texts reveal clearly. Go back to Genesis 3:15, where after the fall God made a promise, but he did not make it directly to Adam or Eve. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head. A descendant of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. That is the first prophecy recorded in the Bible. The promise of a savior who would come through the human lineage, a specific genetic line that was to remain intact. The incursion of the Nephilim was a direct strategic attack against that lineage that bore the seed of the Messiah. If the entire human genome was corrupted, the promised seed could not be born fully human, as the prophecy required. The serpent was trying to eliminate the Savior before his arrival by corrupting the raw material necessary for his birth. The corruption of Genesis 6 was not just a moral failure, it was a military operation of truly cosmic scale. Then the divine verdict arrived, recorded with a precision that leaves no room for possible interpretive ambiguity. Genesis 6:5 records that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth in every detail. Every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Not sometimes, not mostly, always only. Genesis 6:11-12 confirms that the earth was corrupt in the sight of God and was filled with violence without exception. The corruption had been so total that the Hebrew text suggests it even reached the animal kingdom of that ancient world. And then comes the only moment in all of Scripture where God expresses grief over his own creation as creator. Genesis 6:26 records that the Lord regretted having made man on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. This is not an angry God throwing a tantrum. This is a father with a broken heart looking at his children in the darkness. A father who no longer recognizes anything of himself in what his children have become after centuries of total wickedness. And God saw him among all the millions who inhabited the earth at that moment of unprecedented darkness in history. Genesis 6:8-9 records that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a just man, perfect in his generation. That word can be the most powerful in the chapter. Everything before it is darkness. Everything that follows is a lifeline. The word integral in Hebrew is tamim, which means complete, whole, unblemished, pure in its family lineage. Noah's lineage had not been corrupted in a world of Nephilim, violence, and total moral collapse without any parallel. What did it mean to be Noah, to wake up each morning as the only family still praying to the God that everyone had forgotten? Where the neighbors openly mocked that God in the streets and cursed his name without any visible consequences. Where the children saw things that no child should ever see, and no one called it wrong because no one remembered what was right. Noah walked alongside the forges, the markets, and the temples of a civilization that had erased God from every song. And to keep walking anyway, to keep praying anyway, to keep believing against everything that the eyes could see. And then God spoke to that lonely man with instructions that must have sounded completely impossible in that context. Genesis 6:13-14 records the exact words, "I have decided the end of all flesh. The earth is full of violence. I will make them disappear along with the earth. So make yourself an ark of gopher wood with its compartments well sealed." God gave the dimensions with technical precision. 300 cubits long, 50 wide and 30 high, 3 decks and a single door. Approximately 137 meters long, 23 meters wide and 14 meters high, the exact size of a modern large tonnage freighter. Think about the weight of that commission. A man building a ship on dry land in a world that had never seen rain. Noah was building a vessel for a catastrophe unprecedented in any point of recorded or remembered human experience. A disaster for which there was no mental category in that world, no known cultural or natural reference. Each nailed plank was an act of pure faith. Every day of work was a sermon that the whole world ignored with disdain. Every year without rain was one more reason for his neighbors to laugh at the man and the boat stranded on the dry land. Some scholars estimate that the construction of the ark took between 55 and 75 years of continuous work without converting anyone. 75 years of hammering, 75 of preaching, 75 watching people walk away with open mockery. Imagine preaching for 75 years and not winning a single convert outside of your own family, not a single neighbor. Not a single person from that ancient city said, "I believe you. I will prepare myself. Tell me more about what is coming for us." Imagine the loneliness of that fidelity, the doubt whispering every night while the sky remained perfectly clear. Imagine watching your neighbors pass by your construction day after day, knowing that each one of them is going to die very soon, and that none of them believe you, and that getting up the next morning and taking the hammer is all you can do. Then came the final week recorded in Genesis 7:1-4, with an instruction that must have paralyzed that faithful heart. "Enter you and all your family into the ark, for in 7 days I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. 7 days, a final week of grace, while the animals began to arrive from every direction without anyone guiding them. 7 pairs of clean animals, 2 of the unclean, coming from the horizon, walking towards the ark, alone and in silence. Because God sent them, not because someone gathered them. They arrived alone, while the world looked on without understanding anything. Imagine the last 7 days with the animals arriving, the neighbors watching, some still laughing without feeling the danger. Some finally restless, but not taking the step, the sky still clear, the ground still dry, the ark without an ocean. 7 days of silence from the sky, while the world watched the strangest scene it had ever seen in its entire history. And then Genesis 7:16 records the most decisive moment of the entire antediluvian narrative with a single unexpected phrase. Those who entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded, and the Lord shut the door behind them. God himself closed the ark's door. Noah and his sons did not, as God went outside and shut it. When that door closed, the grace period ended, and all those who remained outside were left outside forever, without appeal. Laughter stopped, mockery stopped, and for the first time in 1,600 years, the world fell into a silence it had never known. And then the sky broke apart. Genesis 7:11 records that on that day, all the springs of the great abyss burst forth violently. The windows of the heavens opened at the same time. The underground and upper waters united in a single powerful movement. In Genesis 1, God had separated the waters above from those below as one of his first acts of ordered creation. The flood was not a natural disaster. It was the deliberate undoing of creation by the Creator who had formed it. Genesis 7:19-20 records that the waters prevailed so much that all the high mountains were completely covered. The waters rose above the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits. Every mountain, every city, every forge of Tubal-Cain submerged. Every palace where the descendants of Lamech had reigned for centuries was silently submerged forever. Genesis 7:23 records that God wiped out every living thing on the face of the earth. Men, animals, reptiles, and birds of the sky. Only Noah remained, and those who were with him in the ark, 8 people in the darkness over waters that covered the entire world. Listening only to the rain, the waves, the creaking of the wood, and the silence of a civilization that no longer existed anywhere. Imagine the first night inside the ark after the door was closed by the hand of God from the outside, without warning. The silence meant that there was no one outside who could scream anymore, that the whole world had fallen silent forever. Every person Noah had known, every neighbor who had laughed, every friend he had teased, every child from those old streets, all of them, the entirety of the civilization that Noah had witnessed for decades, erased in 40 days of water and judgment. And Noah, the man who had warned them for 75 years, sitting in the darkness carrying that impossible weight alone. And then Genesis 8:1 utters the most important phrase of the entire antediluvian narrative, with 2 words that change everything. The waters began to recede, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat, and Noah sent out a raven and then a dove. The dove returned with an olive leaf in its beak. Life was returning. The ground reappeared beneath the slowly clearing sky. Genesis 8:20 states that Noah built an altar and offered to the Lord as soon as he stepped onto dry land. The first act of the new world was not to build a city, it was not commerce, it was not to found anything in its own name. It was an altar, the exact opposite of what Cain had done as his first act after distancing himself from the presence of God. Cain's first act was to build a city named after his son, while Noah's first act was to return to God. Genesis 9:11 records the covenant that God established, that never again will all flesh be cut off by the waters of a universal flood. And God placed the rainbow in the sky, not as decoration or as a symbol for children's books, but as a sign of a blood covenant. The Hebrew word for bow is the same as that used for the war bow, the instrument of judgment now aimed at the heavens. The rainbow does not say that the storm is over. The rainbow says that next time God himself will pay the price in his own body. The flood ended, but the war did not end. Sin survived inside the ark, living in the hearts of Noah's sons. It resurrected in the disgrace of Ham, in the Tower of Babel, and in the curse of Canaan. The seed was preserved, but the enemy was not. The flood answered a fundamental question. Can humanity be saved by starting anew, washing the world clean? The answer was no. The issue was never the environment, culture, city, or civilization around them. The problem was the human heart, and that required a completely different kind of rescue that water could not provide. 2,000 years after the flood, Jesus on the Mount of Olives pointed back in time with a precise comparison. Matthew 24:37-39 records his words. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. As in those days, they were eating, drinking, and marrying until the day Noah entered the ark and the flood came. Jesus did not compare the last days to Sodom, nor to Egypt or Babylon. He chose Noah as the exact reference. He compared them to the most corrupt, violent, and spiritually compromised days in all of recorded human history. That is the pattern that Jesus established as a prophetic template of what is to come, not as a possibility, but as certainty. And the key word in that passage is not flood, it is unprepared, not ignorant or rebellious, but simply unprepared. That distinction changes everything, because they did not choose to reject God. They simply stopped paying attention. The evidence was observable every morning and every afternoon, and they chose to ignore it until the water reached their ankles. What defined Noah's days so clearly that Jesus used them as a prophetic image of the end times in history. Technology without God, the forges of Tubal-Cain, and the music of Jubal served pleasure and power, never worship. Violence as entertainment, the boasting of Lamech, the dominion of the Nephilim, the worshipped strength, and the despised weakness. The erosion of the boundaries that God had established, divine categories deliberately erased and confused by rebellion. And such total corruption that it became invisible, that it turned into the Tuesday of the week, into the background noise of life. The horror of the antediluvian world was not that they committed extraordinary evil, but that this evil had become ordinary. No one noticed it anymore because there was nothing to compare it to. There was no moral reference to indicate what had been lost. And a voice warning while no one listened, a man building while the world passed by him without ever stopping. There is a detail in this story that almost no one knows. The name of Methuselah, the man who lived longer than any other being. Some Hebrew scholars suggest that his name means, when he dies, the promised judgment will come upon the whole earth. Methuselah died in the year the flood came. His life was a countdown, a walking prophecy of exactly 969 years. 969 years of God's patience written in the name of a single man who walked the earth until time closed. 2 Peter 3-9 records that the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, but is patient, not wanting anyone to perish. God waited 1,600 years, sent Enoch, sent Noah, named a man with a prophecy of death, and let him live 969 years. That is not the behavior of an angry God. It is the behavior of a patient father, giving every possible opportunity. But patience has its limits, not because God exhausts his love, but for something deeper and fairer than that. The door closed, and it closed forever, without second chances, without appeals, without last-minute negotiations. John 10-9 records the words of Jesus, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will find abundant life." Jesus is the Ark. He is the only door that exists at this time, and that door is still open at this very moment. The same God who waited 1,600 years before sending the flood is waiting now, not because he is slow, but because he is patient. Noah preached for decades, giving the world every chance, and when the day arrived, there was no room for negotiation. You are hearing this now for a reason. It's not a coincidence that you found this information through the algorithm. The same God who warned through Noah and Enoch, who named Methuselah as a walking countdown, is speaking to you now. Right now, the question is not whether the door exists. The question is whether you will cross it before it closes forever. In the darkest era of human history, a man found grace. A family was saved, and one door was enough. If this opens something you have never seen before, subscribe and keep discovering the mysteries that the world has chosen to forget.